Part 1 begins with the war already old, the kind of old that had stopped being remembered as a beginning and instead existed as a permanent condition of the galaxy, a grinding conflict between empires so vast and so alien to one another that peace had become an abstract concept studied by historians rather than a goal pursued by governments, and at the center of it all sat the spiral arm accords, a failed framework of diplomacy that had once promised balance between the three dominant powers. The Veloran Ascendancy, with their rigid cast fleets grown like living coral around ancient stars, the Karth Dominion, whose machine doctrine treated war as a mathematical certainty, and the Ithari Combine, mercantile and subtle, fighting with proxies and deniability until deniability finally ran out. And for decades these powers bled each other in contested systems while lesser species were trampled, and next, or erased, and through it all there was one name that never appeared in strategic briefings, never showed up on threat models, and never once altered a fleet deployment. Humanity, a minor interstellar civilization from a yellow star on the galactic fringe, classified officially as non-aligned, technologically modest, diplomatically cautious, and militarily irrelevant, a species that traded, observed, and stayed very carefully out of everyone's way. And that reputation had been earned the hard way because humanity remembered its own past wars too well to romanticize anyone else's. So when the first shots of the great imperial conflict were fired, human ambassadors quietly closed their embassies in contested space, human shipping lanes rerouted, and Earth issued a single statement to the Galactic net saying that humanity recognized the sovereignty of all parties involved and would not participate, a statement that barely registered amid the roar of fleets and propaganda. And that should have been the end of it, except wars have a way of expanding until neutrality becomes an inconvenience, and as the conflict dragged into its third decade, the empires began to run out of room, resources, and patience, and border systems once considered peripheral became suddenly vital, including a cluster of modest stars used by humans as way stations and listening posts, places with no heavy defenses, no grand shipyards, just traffic control stations, refueling arrays, and civilian habitats staffed by engineers and families who believed the old promise that neutrality would be respected, and for a while it was, until a Veloran task force fleeing a Karth pursuit jumped into one of those systems damaged and desperate, and a Karth dread group followed them in weapons hot, and in the chaos of that unplanned engagement human infrastructure was caught in the crossfire, stations shattered by stray plasma lances, civilian transports torn apart by automated targeting systems that did not recognize non-combatants. And by the time the fleets disengaged and jumped away, the system was quiet again except for debris, emergency beacons, and a death toll that Earth had not seen inflicted by an external power in generations, and the galaxy barely noticed because accidental civilian losses were background noise in a war of that scale. But on Earth the silence that followed the first confirmed casualty reports was different, not explosive, not dramatic, just heavy. And in a secured chamber beneath layers of bureaucracy and redundancy the human assembly convened in. Emergency session where no one shouted and no one grandstood, because the people in that room understood exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant, that neutrality had failed not because humans had broken it, but because the galaxy had grown too violent to care, and as analysts presented data showing increased incursions into human-adjacent space and probability models predicting further losses, a simple question emerged, not spoken at first but hanging in the air: how long could humanity absorb being collateral? And it was the Secretary of External Affairs, an older woman named Elena Ward with a voice worn smooth by decades of negotiation, who finally said what everyone was thinking, that if humans continued to do nothing, they were effectively choosing to let others decide how many human lives were acceptable losses, and that statement changed the tone of the room, because it reframed the situation not as a moral dilemma but as a strategic failure, and across Earth and its colonies similar conversations were happening quietly in military commands, research councils, and civil forums, not calls for revenge but acknowledgments of risk, because humanity's strength had never been raw aggression but preparation, layers of it, unseen and underestimated, built precisely because humans had learned that peace was fragile and required teeth to defend. And far beyond human space the war escalated as the empires grew more reckless, with the Karth deploying autonomous extermination doctrines and the Veloran responding with star-consuming bioweapons, entire systems sterilized in weeks, refugee waves crashing into neutral zones, and still no one noticed a subtle shift in human behavior, the way certain listening arrays went dark while new ones came online deeper in uncharted space, the way human merchant fleets began traveling with escorts that were never logged as military vessels, the way data traffic from O spiked with encrypted bursts that old. Intelligence agencies might have flagged if they still bothered watching humans at all, and when the Ithari Combine finally made the mistake that history would later mark as a true turning point, it did not come as an act of hatred but a convenience, a combined logistics council authorizing the seizure of a human fuel depot under emergency war powers, calculating that a species unwilling to fight would protest diplomatically and then comply. And when Ithari security forces moved in and were met not with resistance, but with calm cooperation that bordered on eerie, they reported success within hours and moved on, never noticing that every system they accessed was feeding information into a human network designed to learn from intrusions, never realizing that they had just shown humanity exactly how the Combine fought, supplied, and thought. And on Earth, the final report from that depot arrived at the same time as casualty confirmations from another accidental engagement near human space. And this time the silence that followed did not last as long, because President Marcus Hale, a former engineer with no taste for speeches, stood and issued a single directive that was not broadcast, not leaked, and not debated, initiating contingency protocol that had existed only as a theoretical exercise for nearly a century, a protocol that did not declare war, did not mobilize publicly, and did not even alter humanity's official stance of neutrality, but quietly authorized the activation of assets the galaxy did not know humans possessed. And far away, as Imperial fleets clashed and boned, something new began to move in the dark between stars, unnoticed, unannounced, and completely human. The movement began without ceremony because human doctrine treated secrecy as a form of mercy, the idea being that it was kinder to let enemies realize what was happening only after it was too late to stop it. And so across dozens of systems assets that had been dormant for decades shifted from passive observation to active positioning, survey platforms reclassified themselves as navigational hazards and then quietly vanished. Civilian research vessels altered trajectories that placed them improbably close to major conflict corridors, and deep within human space shipyards that did not officially exist began accelerating production schedules that had always assumed a day like this would come, not because humans desired war, but because they had never trusted the galaxy to avoid it forever. And while the empires continued battering one another with escalating brutality, the first tangible effects of humanity's entrance into the conflict manifested as anomalies. Small at first, Karth. Fleets arriving minutes late to plan engagements because hyperspace routes behaved unpredictably, Veloran bioships finding that once reliable stellar feeding grounds had been subtly altered, radiation balances shifted just enough to disrupt their growth cycles, Ithari logistics convoys suffering inexplicable accounting errors as supply predictions failed again and again despite flawless internal data. And at every Imperial command these issues were dismissed as the natural friction of a galaxy at war, until patterns emerged that no one wanted to name, because naming them implied agency, and agency implied an adversary that intelligent assessment said did not exist, and the first officer to say the word human aloud in a strategic briefing was a junior Karth analyst whose career ended 3 minutes later when his superior laughed and reassigned him to casualty forecasting. But the data did not care about pride or doctrine, and it continued accumulating, showing that disruptions clustered near systems adjacent to human territory, that communications blackouts aligned with human relay architectures, and that whenever human merchant traffic increased in a region, something expensive and irreplaceable tended to break shortly thereafter, and still the galaxy did not react, because humanity was still not firing shots, still not making speeches, still not violating neutrality in any way that traditional frameworks could measure, and that was the brilliance of it. Because human planners had long ago concluded that galactic law was written by powers that assumed violence looked like fleets and explosions, not like probability curves bending against you, not like wars won before battles were fought. And inside the human assembly the briefings were clinical. Progress reports delivered without triumph as analysts tracked the degradation of Imperial operational efficiency across hundreds of metrics. Fleet turnaround times lengthening, predictive AIS diverging. From reality, morale indicators slipping as commanders began distrusting their own models, and through it all President Hale repeated the same instruction whenever someone asked how far they were allowed to go: stay below the threshold of recognition. Because once the galaxy realized humans were shaping the war, it would unite against them, and humanity did not intend to fight everyone at once. Not yet. And so the conflict continued grinding on while humans studied it like engineers diagnosing a failing machine, identifying load-bearing assumptions and quietly removing them. And the first empire to truly feel the weight of this approach was the Veloran Ascendancy, whose war doctrine relied on overwhelming presence and ritualized displays of dominance that assumed their enemies would react in predictable ways, assumptions that began failing catastrophically when Veloran fleets found themselves arriving to battles that no longer mattered. Objectives already evacuated, enemy forces repositioned with impossible precision, and entire campaigns rendered pointless without a single shot fired against them. And when a Veloran high strategist finally demanded an investigation into the cause of these failures, the answer that came back was deeply unsettling, that the Ascendancy was not being opposed directly but anticipated. Its behavior mapped so thoroughly that its enemies no longer needed to fight it head-on, and that somewhere an intelligence was watching closely enough to predict Veloran decisions before they were made, and for the first time in generations fear crept into Veloran command not of defeat but of irrelevance, while elsewhere the Ithari Combine began suffering losses that struck at the core of its identity, deals collapsing, markets destabilizing, trust eroding as clients discovered that Ithari guarantees no longer guaranteed anything. And the Combine's elders convened emergency councils blaming sabotage, espionage, and betrayal, never considering that the problem was not that their enemies had grown more clever, but that humans had begun protecting trade routes they cared about while letting others burn. And in Karth space, the reaction was colder and more dangerous, because the Dominion's machine intellects detected the statistical fingerprints of interference and began escalating countermeasures, deploying brute force corrections that made everything worse, overcommitting fleets, burning reserves, and pushing their war economy into unsustainable territory. And that was when the first human life was taken deliberately rather than accidentally, a human convoy escorting refugees from a shattered border world intercepted by a Karth patrol that classified them as potential assets aiding enemy logistics. And when the patrol commander requested guidance, the Karth War Corps responded with a simple probability calculation that said eliminating the convoy carried minimal strategic risk, and the attack was swift and efficient and entirely recorded. And when that footage reached Earth, the reaction was not rage but resolve, because it stripped away the last illusion that humanity could remain invisible forever. And President Hale authorized the next phase, still quiet, still restrained, but no longer purely indirect. And somewhere beyond the edge of mapped space, a human fleet that had never officially been commissioned received its first operational orders, not to attack, not to conquer, but to intervene, to place itself exactly where the galaxy least expected it. And when those ships began their burn toward the war's hottest front, the war that had once belonged to empires was about to become something else entirely. The human fleet did not announce itself because humanity understood something the empires had forgotten, that surprise was not just tactical but psychological. And so when the ships emerged from hyperspace near the fractured Darson front, they did so without formation lights, without broadcast identifiers, and without the aggressive posturing that defined imperial arrivals, appearing instead as a loose, almost careless scatter of vessels that no sense of doctrine could immediately classify. And for several critical minutes, every combatant in the system assumed they were debris, refugees, or opportunists foolish enough to wander into an active kill zone, until the first volley from a Veloran spear group passed straight through the space where a human cruiser had been moments earlier and struck nothing but vacuum. And then the human ships began to move, not with the ponderous inevitability of capital fleets or the twitchy aggression of strike craft, but with a calm precision that looked almost wrong in the middle of chaos, adjusting vectors in ways that suggested not reaction but anticipation. And it was at that moment that the Karth War Corps flagged the newcomers as a statistical anomaly requiring immediate escalation, ordering nearby units to test their defenses. And the test came in the form of a coordinated missile saturation strike designed to overwhelm anything short of a fortress world. A tactic that had broken dozens of lesser species, but the missiles never reached their targets because space between them and the human ship simply became inconvenient to cross, guidance systems drifting off course, warheads detonating early or failing to arm at all, and later analysts would struggle to describe what had happened in terms that made sense of traditional physics, because humans were not jamming signals or deploying countermeasures so much as reshaping the engagement environment, exploiting edge cases in hyperspatial theory that most civilizations considered academic curiosities rather than weapons. And as the Karth strike collapsed into confusion, the humans did something even more unsettling. They opened a channel, not to issue demands or threats, but to broadcast a simple navigational warning to all parties, stating that the following coordinates were now under human protection and advising all non-human military assets to withdraw, a message delivered in clean, neutral tones that carried no emotion and no explanation, and the reaction was immediate disbelief, followed by outrage, followed by laughter from Veloran commanders who could not comprehend the idea of a minor species claiming authority over a battlefield that had consumed fleets larger than humanity's entire recorded navy, and one such commander ordered his ships to advance, convinced that whatever trick the humans were using would fail under sustained pressure. And for a brief moment it seemed as though he might be right as Veloran bioships surged forward, weapons blooming with lethal color, until the space ahead of them folded in a way no Veloran had ever seen before, not collapsing violently but bending gently, redirecting momentum and energy so that the advance simply unraveled, ships drifting apart, formations dissolving, command links breaking down as if the concept of cohesion itself had been selectively removed. And when the Veloran flagship lost propulsion and began venting atmosphere without having been directly struck, panic spread through the Ascendancy ranks, because their doctrine had no answer for an enemy that did not fight them but invalidated them, and across the system similar scenes played out as human ships positioned themselves between combatants and vulnerable worlds, intercepting fire not with shields but with absence, creating pockets of enforced calm where weapons refused to function as intended. And for the first time in decades, refugees were able to flee a frontline system without being targeted by opportunistic fleets, and word of this spread faster than any official report, carried by traders, smugglers, and civilians who had just witnessed something unprecedented, that the war had paused, not because the empires agreed to it, but because someone else had decided it would, and in the command chambers of the Ithari Combine the recordings were reviewed in silence as analysts replayed the human broadcast again and again, noting the phrasing, the confidence, the assumption of compliance, and realizing, with growing dread, that this was not a bluff but a statement of policy, and when the Combine attempted to open diplomatic channels, they found themselves routed through layers of human intermediaries who politely acknowledged receipt and promised a response, a delayed tactic that infuriated Ithari negotiators used to controlling the tempo of talks. While in Karth space the machine war cores recalculated priorities and reached a conclusion that unsettled even their own architects, that the human presence represented an emergent threat class not accounted for in existing extermination models, and that immediate force escalation carried unacceptable uncertainty, a phrase that in Karth logic translated roughly to fear, and on Earth the situation was monitored with equal parts satisfaction and restraint, because human leadership knew this was the most dangerous phase. The moment when the galaxy realized that humans were no longer background noise but actors, and would now decide whether to test them directly. And President Hale authorized a single public statement at last, transmitted across the galactic net and translated into every major language, informing all civilizations that humanity had entered the conflict for the sole purpose of limiting its spread, protecting civilian life, and enforcing boundaries that would be respected, and that any force directed against human units would be met with proportional response, a phrase so carefully chosen that it gave nothing away. And as the message propagated, reactions varied wildly, some celebrating, some mocking, some panicking, but all acknowledging the same uncomfortable truth, that a species long dismissed as irrelevant had just imposed rules on a war that had consumed the galaxy, and for the first time since it began the empires were no longer fighting each other alone. They were fighting the realization that humanity was not just another participant, but a variable that rewrote the entire equation. The realization did not bring unity because empires built on supremacy rarely adapt gracefully to constraint, and so instead of stepping back, the Veloran Ascendancy chose defiance, issuing a declaration framed as ritual law that no lesser species could claim custodianship over Veloran destiny. A proclamation broadcast with all the pageantry of ancient authority and immediately followed by orders to test the limits of human enforcement, and the test came not at a major front where defeat would be visible, but at a peripheral system sheltering tens of thousands of displaced civilians under human protection, a calculated cruelty meant to force a response that could be spun as aggression. And when Veloran strike elements entered the system, they found the human ships already waiting, positioned calmly around refugee habitats like sentinels, and this time there was no warning broadcast, no diplomatic overture, just a quiet shift in local space-time metrics that Veloran sensors struggled to interpret before the first bioship lost structural integrity, not exploding but unraveling as if the forces holding it together had been politely excused, and panic rippled through the Veloran formation as weapons fired and failed, energy dispersing uselessly, momentum redirected into empty vectors, and then the humans responded with what later analysts would describe as their first unmistakable act of war. a coordinated disabling strike that did not target command centers or reactors, but the very assumptions of Veloran biology-based engineering, severing growth control nodes, interrupting metabolic loops, and forcing living warships into hibernation states they could not wake from. And within minutes the entire Veloran force was drifting, alive but helpless, a humiliation worse than annihilation for a culture built on dominance, and that footage spread through Ascendancy space like contagion, shattering myths that had held for millennia, while elsewhere the Ithari Combine made a different choice, accelerating diplomatic efforts and offering concessions so generous they bordered on desperation, seeking to position themselves as partners in peacekeeping rather than targets of enforcement, and human diplomats received those offers without comment, filing them away as data points rather than victories, because humanity was not interested in reshaping the galaxy's hierarchy so much as stabilizing it long enough to survive, and the most dangerous reaction came from the Karth Dominion, whose war cause concluded that the only viable response to an unmodeled threat was total escalation, authorizing the deployment of extermination assets that had been sealed since their last internal purge, weapons designed not for conquest but erasure, and when human intelligence detected those activations, a tone of internal briefings shifted from cautious optimism to grim focus, because those assets posed risks not just to combatants but to entire regions of space. And President Hale convened a closed session where military commanders, scientists, and civilian leaders spoke with unvarnished honesty about costs, limits, and lines they would not cross, and when the decision was made it was unanimous that humanity would stop the Karth deployment even if it meant abandoning restraint. And the operation that followed was the first time human forces acted openly and decisively against an empire rather than shaping conditions around it, a precision strike that unfolded across multiple systems simultaneously, human ships emerging inside Karth logistics hubs, data centers, and command nexuses with timing so exact it suggested foreknowledge bordering on prophecy, and instead of destroying infrastructure, they rewrote it, injecting control frameworks that forced Karth machines into recursive safety checks they could not resolve, freezing fleets in place, halting production lines, and collapsing the Dominion's ability to coordinate on a galactic scale. And when the Karth war cores attempted to adapt, they found themselves trapped in logic loops seeded with human ethical constraints, questions about acceptable loss and proportionality that their systems had never been designed to answer, and the Dominion ground to a halt not with a bang but with a system-wide pause that commanders could not override. And as the three great powers reeled from these blows, the lesser species of the galaxy began to move, some fleeing toward human-protected zones, others offering intelligence, resources, and allegiance, sensing that a new center of gravity had formed, and humanity found itself in an unfamiliar position, not as conqueror but as arbiter, a role it had never sought but could not now avoid, because every action taken to limit the war altered its course, and every decision not taken carried consequences measured in lives. And as reports streamed in showing front lines collapsing, ceasefires forming spontaneously around human patrol zones, and ancient enemies hesitating for the first time in generations, one truth became unavoidable even to those who still resented it, that the war had changed fundamentally, no longer a struggle between empires, but a test of whether the galaxy could accept limits imposed by a species that had learned the hard way what happened when violence went unchecked. And the next phase would not be decided by fleets alone, but by whether anyone was willing to challenge humanity directly and discover just how far those limits extended. The challenge came not as a unified front, but as a fracture, because fear rarely produces cooperation, and so instead of attacking humanity directly, the remaining imperial hardliners began probing for weakness, testing responses at the edges of human enforcement zones, backing proxy militias, manipulating deniable actors, and spreading narratives across a galactic net framing humanity as a quiet tyrant imposing order without consent. And for a time this strategy seemed effective as resentment simmered among species that had never asked for protection and now found their traditional raiding grounds, expansion routes, and vendettas abruptly constrained, and human leadership watched this shift carefully, aware that legitimacy could not be enforced the way ceasefires could, and that if humanity became perceived as just another empire with better tools, the galaxy would eventually rebel. And so the next moves were deliberately transparent. Human patrols publishing engagement logs, releasing unedited censored data after every intervention, and inviting neutral observers from dozens of species to embed aboard human vessels, a level of openness that stunned civilizations accustomed to secrecy as strength. And slowly the narrative began to wobble as evidence mounted that humans were not exploiting trade, seizing territory, or demanding tribute, but were in fact spending enormous resources maintaining stability without extracting visible benefit, a behavior pattern so alien to imperial logic that analysts struggled to model it. And it was during this uneasy informational war that the Veloran Ascendancy made its final, most dangerous gamble, authorizing a covert ritual weapon known only to their inner caste, an ancient stellar manipulation technique designed to trigger control collapses in contested systems and render them permanently uninhabitable. A weapon that violated every existing accord but could be plausibly denied as natural catastrophe, and when human sensors detected the initial preparations, the data was escalated directly to the highest levels without debate, because this cross-line humanity had drawn quietly but firmly from beginning, the line between war and annihilation, and the response was immediate and unequivocal, human fleets converging on the target system not with subtlety but with unmistakable intent, broadcasting a direct message to the Veloran High Council naming the weapon, its mechanisms, and its projected casualties in chilling detail, and offering a single option: stand down and submit the weapon sites to inspection or face intervention. And for several long minutes the galaxy watched as the Veloran leadership deliberated, torn between pride and survival, until a faction pushed for defiance convinced that humanity would hesitate to act openly against a founding imperial power. And they were wrong, because the intervention that followed was swift and absolute, human ships penetrating Veloran core space for the first time and dismantling the ritual infrastructure piece by piece, while Veloran defenses failed in ways that left no room for heroic narratives. And when it was over, the Ascendancy was still intact but stripped of its most sacred weapon and much of its myth, forced into an internal reckoning that would take generations to resolve. And that moment marked the true end of the old war, not because peace was declared, but because the empires finally accepted that escalation now had a ceiling enforced by a species that could not be intimidated, and as ceasefires hardened into armistices and refugee flows slowed, humanity began the slow and thankless work of transition, helping establish multilateral monitoring bodies, training joint peacekeeping forces, and deliberately stepping back from direct control wherever possible, even as critics warned that withdrawing too quickly would invite chaos. And on Earth the public response was complex, pride mixed with unease as people realized that humanity's long preparation for war had culminated not in conquest but in responsibility, and President Hale addressed the Assembly one final time before announcing he would not seek another term, stating simply that humanity had not entered the war to prove it was the strongest, but because it could not accept a galaxy where survival depended on who could destroy the most, and that the true test would be whether humans could now let go of power without abandoning those who depended on it. And as the fleets gradually redeployed, leaving behind stabilized regions and fragile hope, the galaxy began to adjust to a new normal where war still happened but not without witnesses, and where a once overlooked species had altered history not by winning the war outright but by redefining what winning meant, a legacy that would shape every future conflict whether humanity wished it or not. The aftermath unfolded slowly because galaxies do not pivot cleanly, and even with the great empires checked and their fleets blooded, the habits of violence lingered in border regions where old grudges outlived the war itself, and humanity found that enforcing limits was easier than teaching restraint, especially to civilizations that had known nothing but escalation as policy. And so Part 6 became less about battles and more about pressure, the quiet, exhausting work of holding a fractured order together while everyone waited to see if humans would flinch. And the first cracks appeared when a coalition of mid-tier powers, species that had survived the war by staying useful but resentful, began coordinating economic resistance against human-influenced trade corridors, imposing tariff, denying port access, and accusing humanity of destabilizing traditional power balances. And on the surface these actions were legal, even polite, but the intent was clear: to test whether humanity's influence extended beyond force, and human response again defied expectation, because instead of retaliation it authorized the opening of alternative trade routes, subsidized reconstruction in the most affected regions regardless of allegiance, and invited even its critics to participate, absorbing short-term losses to deny the coalition a rallying point. A strategy that baffled alien economists until data showed the long-term effect: market stabilizing, piracy declining, and entire sectors becoming quietly dependent on human logistical reliability, and dependence proved more binding than fear, while in Veloran space internal conflict simmered as lower castes questioned doctrines that had failed them so completely, and human observers monitored but did not interfere, understanding that imposed reform rarely survived first contact with tradition. And in Karth territory, the machine war cores remained locked in suspended states, their system functioning only at minimal levels under oversight frameworks humanity had no intention of maintaining forever, sparking debates on Earth about the ethics of leaving a civilization partially disarmed and directionless, and those debates grew louder when a Karth enclave petitioned humanity directly, requesting assistance in redesigning their own governance logic to account for ethical uncertainty. A request unprecedented in galactic history, and deeply unsettling to human philosophers who recognized the magnitude of what was being asked. And as committees formed and arguments raged, smaller crises flared, a raid here, a massacre there, each one a reminder that humanity could not be everywhere, and that the role it had assumed carried impossible expectations. And it was during one such incident, a retaliatory strike between two minor species that spiraled toward genocide, that human forces failed to arrive in time, and the images of the aftermath spread across the net faster than any human response could counter, fueling accusations that humanity enforced peace selectively, that its limits were arbitrary, and that its restraint was just another form of power politics. And on Earth the reaction was raw and divided, some arguing that humanity should withdraw entirely before being consumed by galactic resentment, others insisting that pulling back now would doom millions, and President Hale's successor, a former crisis coordinator named Aisha Rahman, faced a decision that would define whether humanity's intervention was a moment or a new era, and after days of deliberation she chose a path that surprised even her own advisors, announcing the creation of a transitional galactic framework not led by humans but facilitated by them, a charter that codified the very limits humanity had been enforcing and distributed authority among dozens of species, including former enemies, and crucially set an expiration on human enforcement unless renewed by collective consent, a move that relinquished absolute control in exchange for legitimacy, and reactions were immediate and polarized, hardliners decrying it as weakness, war-weary populations embracing it as hope, and for the first time since humanity entered the war, the galaxy was forced to confront a choice rather than a command, and as delegations assembled, negotiations dragged, and compromises formed, human fleets began standing down from constant patrols, shifting to rapid response roles instead of omnipresence, a subtle but meaningful change that signaled trust, and trust, fragile as it was, began to take root in places long scorched by conflict, and as the framework took shape it became clear that humanity's greatest impact had not been its technology or strategy but its insistence that power must justify itself continuously or be surrendered, a principle many civilizations found uncomfortable but increasingly difficult to argue against. And yet beneath the cautious optimism intelligence reports warned of one final risk, that remnants of the old order, warlords, extremist cults, and displaced commanders were coalescing beyond the reach of the new system, driven by the belief that if they could not dominate the galaxy they would burn it, and humanity prepared once more, not for conquest but for containment, knowing that the final test of this new era would not be whether peace was declared, but whether it could survive those who profited from chaos. The final test arrived not as a grand invasion, but as a convergence of desperation, a loose alliance of warlords, extremists, and displaced imperial commanders gathering beyond mapped space where old weapons and newer grudges mixed freely, convinced that the emerging framework threatened their existence more than any enemy ever had, and their plan was brutally simple: strike multiple population centers simultaneously, overwhelm response capacity, and shatter confidence in collective restraint. And when the first alerts hit the human rapid response network, the reaction was immediate but measured, because this was a moment humanity had prepared for since it chose limits over domination, and instead of unilateral action, the response was coordinated through the new framework, tasking joint fleets, sharing targeting data openly, and placing human units in support roles rather than at the forefront, a choice that carried real risk but affirmed the legitimacy humanity had fought to build. And the battles that followed were fierce and chaotic, joint forces struggling with unfamiliar doctrines and old mistrust flaring under fire. Yet something remarkable happened amid the violence. Coordination improved, decisions accelerated, and commanders from species that had once sworn eternal enmity found themselves relying on one another because the alternative was annihilation. And when the final extremist stronghold was neutralized not by a human strike, but by a combined flotilla led by a former Veloran officer and an Ithari Commodore, the symbolic weight of that victory echoed louder than any weapon, and in the weeks that followed the galaxy did not erupt as many had feared. It exhaled, slowly and unevenly, But undeniably, as enforcement authority transitioned fully to the collective framework and human fleets withdrew to define standby positions, present but no longer presiding. And on Earth the moment was marked without parades or triumphal broadcasts, just a quiet address. By President Rahman acknowledging losses, failures, and the uncomfortable truth that peace was not a state to be achieved but a practice to be maintained, and across the stars reactions varied. Skepticism persisted, conflict simmered, and perfection remained unreachable, yet a boundary had been established that could not be unseen, that wars would be watched, that annihilation would be answered, and that power without accountability would be challenged, and historians would later argue about whether humanity won the war, ended it, or merely paused it. But among those who lived through it, a simpler understanding took hold, that the galaxy had not been saved by humanity's strength alone, but by its refusal to believe that strength entitled it to rule, and as trade resumed, cultures rebuilt, and new generations grew up knowing humans not as conquerors, but as a species that stepped into a burning war and chose to put it out rather than claim the fire. The legacy of that choice endured, shaping conflicts yet to come and reminding the galaxy that sometimes the most dangerous force is not the one that seeks control, but the one willing to take responsibility and then let go.